The Kingdom of England, Part 1, Pre-Anglo-Saxon Foundations. The history of the Kingdom of England cannot be meaningfully understood without tracing the foundations laid long before the kingdom formally emerged. The island of Great Britain, on which England occupies the southern and central portion, has seen human habitation for tens of thousands of years. Its recorded history, however, begins with the documentation of external observers, most notably the Romans. Britannia before the Romans. Before Roman conquest, the region now known as England was inhabited by Celtic-speaking tribes, loosely organized into kinship-based societies. These tribes, including the Catavilani, Trinovans, Iceni, and others, practiced agriculture, metallurgy, and trade. Despite their shared linguistic and cultural traits, they lacked political unity, a fact that would ease Roman incursion. Their religion was polytheistic and animistic, often overseen by the priestly caste known as the Druids. Religious and judicial authority often overlapped in these figures, especially in the western and northern parts of Britain. While archaeological evidence points to significant societal sophistication, including hill forts, roads, and trade routes, there was no single kingdom or centralized rule. The Roman conquest and occupation, 43 to 410 AD. Julius Caesar made two brief expeditions into Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, but it was Emperor Claudius who initiated full-scale invasion in 43 AD. Roman rule gradually extended across much of what is now England, although the north remained unstable and was eventually demarcated by Hadrian's Wall. Roman Britain was not a kingdom but a province of the Roman Empire, administered by a governor appointed from Rome. The Romans introduced urbanization, writing, coinage, roads, and significant architectural advancements. Towns like Londinium, London, Verulamium, St. Albans, and Eboracum, York, became regional centers of trade and governance. Despite these changes, Romanization was partial. Local aristocracies were often incorporated into the imperial structure, but rural Britain retained many indigenous characteristics. Moreover, Roman control was militarized, and rebellions were not infrequent, most notably the revolt led by Boudica of the Iceni in 60 to 61 AD. By the early 5th century, as Roman central authority weakened, imperial legions were recalled from Britain. This left the Romano-British population vulnerable to incursions from the Picts, Irish, and increasingly, Germanic groups across the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon migrations and the end of Roman Britain. The exact timeline and mechanism of Anglo-Saxon migration remain debated. However, it is clear that during the 5th and 6th centuries, Germanic-speaking peoples, identified broadly as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began to settle in significant numbers. Whether through military conquest, negotiated settlement, or demographic pressure, they gradually supplanted Roman institutions and reshaped the cultural landscape. This process was not instantaneous. For generations, Romano-British polities struggled to resist these newcomers. The legendary figure of King Arthur, whose historicity remains uncertain, is often imagined as a Romano-British warlord fighting against Anglo-Saxon expansion. However, the historical evidence for such a figure is fragmentary at best. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon cultural and political presence dominated most of what is now England. Christianity, which had spread in Roman Britain, diminished in the wake of pagan Anglo-Saxon dominance, only to be reintroduced later by Christian missionaries, particularly from Ireland and Rome. The Heptarchy, England before unification. The period between the 6th and 9th centuries is often referred to as the era of the Heptarchy. A term describing the 7 principal Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. These kingdoms were not equally powerful or permanent, borders shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, and supremacy passed from one to another. Northumbria, formed by the unification of Bernicia and Dara, was dominant in the early 7th century under kings like Edwin and Oswald. Mercia, under rulers like Penda and Offa, reached its zenith in the 8th century. Offa's dyke, a great earthwork, marked the border with Wales and symbolized Mercian authority. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, would ultimately rise to supremacy in the 9th century, especially under King Alfred. Religious transformation was another hallmark of the period. Missionaries such as Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory I in 597, and Aidan of Lindisfarne, from Irish tradition, catalyzed the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Synods such as Whitby, 664 AD, helped establish uniformity of practice and hierarchy within the English Church. Underscore 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 underscore. Early Anglo-Saxon government and society. These early kingdoms were monarchies in which the king held military, judicial, and spiritual authority, often sanctified by divine right. Power was also decentralized, local lords, or ealdormen, wielded significant influence, and governance was facilitated through assemblies called witan. Society was hierarchical but fluid. Below the king were nobles, thanes, followed by free peasants, ceorls, and then slaves, thralls. Law codes began to be written, some of the earliest in English history, prescribing fines and compensations rather than corporal punishment, revealing a society increasingly structured by codified norms. The economy was primarily agrarian, based on small rural communities centered around estates. Towns were rare and rudimentary, but trade persisted, especially with the Frankish world and Scandinavia. Part 2: The Rise of Wessex and the Viking Invasions. By the late 8th century, the geopolitical balance among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to shift decisively in favor of Wessex. While Northumbria and Mercia had earlier enjoyed periods of hegemony, internal divisions and external threats, most notably from the Viking incursions, gradually undermined their dominance. It was Wessex that emerged as the strongest and most resilient kingdom, capable of both resisting and adapting to these new challenges. The advent of the Vikings. The first recorded Viking raid on England occurred in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne. The attack shocked Christian Europe and marked the beginning of nearly 2 centuries of Norse incursions, raids, settlements, and warfare. Initially sporadic and seasonal, these raids soon became more systematic and widespread, targeting religious centers, towns, and rural communities. By the mid-9th century, Viking forces had evolved into what Anglo-Saxon chroniclers termed the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, this force sought not merely plunder but conquest and settlement. Landing in East Anglia in 865 AD, the army launched a sustained campaign of occupation, defeating local rulers and establishing Scandinavian control over large parts of England. Wessex under Alfred the Great. During this period of crisis, Wessex was ruled by King Ethelwulf and later by his sons, culminating in the accession of Alfred the Great in 871 AD. Alfred's reign, 871 to 899, marks a turning point in English history. Though initially forced into retreat by Viking advances, Alfred eventually regrouped, reformed, and counterattacked. His military reforms included the establishment of a network of fortified towns, an improved army mobilization system, and a navy to counter Viking mobility. These defensive measures enabled Wessex to withstand further incursions and eventually negotiate a treaty with the Viking leader Guthrum. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore, c. 878, established a division of England between Wessex-controlled territory in the south and west, and the Danelaw, an area under Norse control encompassing much of eastern and northern England. Beyond his military leadership, Alfred was also a patron of learning and legal reform. He commissioned the translation of Latin texts into Old English, promoted literacy among the clergy, and codified a law code that integrated Christian principles with Germanic customs. These initiatives not only strengthened his kingdom internally but also laid the groundwork for a more unified English identity. The Danelaw and Norse settlement. The Danelaw represented more than just a political division, it signified a distinct legal and cultural region within England. Norse law, language, and customs took root, especially in urban centres like York, Jorvik, Lincoln, and Nottingham. Scandinavian place names, archaeological evidence of Norse crafts, and linguistic influences in Northern English dialects all testify to the profound impact of this settlement. Despite its autonomy, the Danelaw was not a monolith. It comprised various local rulers and communities, some of which maintained uneasy truces with Wessex, while others continued raiding. The fluidity of the boundaries ensured that conflict remained a persistent feature of the Anglo-Scandinavian landscape. Underscore 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 underscore. Toward unification, the sons of Alfred. Alfred's successors continued his policy of military fortification, legal codification, and territorial expansion. His son, Edward the Elder, r. 899–924, and daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, launched campaigns to reconquer Danelaw territories, establishing a series of fortified centers in reconquered regions. Together, they reclaimed control of central and eastern England. Following Edward's death, his son Athelstan emerged as the most powerful Anglo-Saxon king to date. In 927, Athelstan achieved what no previous ruler had accomplished. He consolidated control over nearly all of England, including Northumbria, which had long been contested between Anglo-Saxons and Norse rulers. He is often considered the first true king of all England. Ethelstan's reign, 924–939, was marked not only by military consolidation but also by increased engagement with continental Europe. He forged alliances through dynastic marriages, maintained correspondence with foreign courts, and positioned England as an emerging European power. His legal codes emphasized royal authority and moral conduct, and his court became a center of learning and ecclesiastical reform. Underscore 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 underscore. Continued Viking pressure and royal consolidation. The unity achieved under Athelstan was tested by renewed Viking pressure during the reigns of his successors. Kings Edmund I, r. 939–946, Eadred, r. 946–955, and Eadwig, r. 955–959, struggled with internal dissent and external threats, particularly in Northumbria. However, it was under King Edgar the Peaceful, r. 959–975, that the Kingdom of England experienced a rare period of stability and centralization. Edgar worked closely with the Church, especially with reform-minded ecclesiastics like Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. Monastic reform flourished, with a revival of the Benedictine rule and the expansion of monastic communities. Edgar's coronation in 973 at Bath was a highly symbolic event, reflecting not only his authority over England but also his claim to be overlord of Britain. The ceremony, designed by Dunstan, influenced English coronation rites for centuries. Edgar's rule consolidated the institutions of royal governance and reinforced the idea of a unified English monarchy. Part 3, Athelred, the Danish Conquest, and the Rise of Nut. The relative peace and consolidation achieved during the reign of King Edgar the Peaceful did not endure. Upon his death in 975, the succession passed to his young son Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr. His brief reign, 975–978, was marked by factional struggles among the nobility and ecclesiastical leaders. In 978, Edward was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, likely orchestrated by supporters of his younger half-brother, Athelred. Athelred the Unready, r. 978–1016. Athelred II, later nicknamed the Unready, unread in Old English, meaning ill-advised rather than unprepared, inherited a kingdom increasingly vulnerable to renewed Viking aggression. His reign, lasting nearly 4 decades, was defined by military weakness, political indecision, and periodic bouts of national crisis. Viking raids resumed in earnest during the 980s, escalating into full-scale invasions by the 990s. Ethelred's responses oscillated between military resistance and the payment of Danegeld, a tribute paid to Viking leaders to secure temporary peace. These payments, while occasionally effective, drained the royal treasury and encouraged further extortion. In 1002, Athelred ordered the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre, a coordinated killing of Danes living in England. Though its scale and effectiveness are debated, the massacre provoked a severe response from Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who launched an intensified campaign of conquest. By 1013, Sweyn had effectively seized control of England, forcing Athelred into exile in Normandy. However, Sweyn died unexpectedly in 1014, and Athelred briefly returned to power. His restoration was tenuous, facing resistance from Danes and internal rivals. The rise of Knut the Great. Sweyn's son, Knut, also spelled Canute, returned in 1015 with a formidable army. Athelred died in 1016, and his son, Edmund Ironside, took up the defense of England. Edmund and Knut engaged in a series of battles, culminating in the Battle of Issanden. Though Edmund fought valiantly, he was forced into a power-sharing arrangement with Knut. Following Edmund's death later in 1016, Knut became the undisputed king of England. His ascension marked the establishment of a new Scandinavian dynasty and a dramatic shift in the monarchy's character. Underscore 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 underscore. Knut's North Sea Empire. Knut ruled England from 1016 until his death in 1035, and during that time, he also became King of Denmark, 1018, and Norway, 1028, creating a vast North Sea Empire. Despite his Danish origin, Knut proved to be an effective and pragmatic ruler in England. He retained many Anglo-Saxon institutions, respected the church, and sought to integrate his rule with English traditions. He issued law codes in English, maintained the structure of local governance through shires and hundreds, and upheld ecclesiastical privileges. His marriage to Emma of Normandy, the widow of Athelred, helped legitimize his rule and bind the old and new regimes. Knut's reign is often regarded as a period of relative stability. He patronized the church, funded monastic houses, and sought to present himself as a Christian king in the mold of his predecessors. Despite his foreign origins, Knut was accepted, albeit cautiously, by the English elite. Upon his death, however, the empire quickly fragmented. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, proved unequal to the task of preserving unity. England entered another brief period of dynastic uncertainty. Underscore 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 underscore. The return of the House of Wessex. After the death of Harthacnut in 1042, the throne passed back to the native royal line in the person of Edward the Confessor, son of Athelred and Emma. Edward's reign, 1042–1066, is notable for its piety, the growing influence of Norman courtiers, and the increasing power of the Godwin family, especially Earl Godwin and his son Harold. Edward, raised in exile in Normandy, brought with him Norman advisors and customs, creating tensions with the entrenched Anglo-Saxon nobility. His inability or unwillingness to produce an heir intensified succession anxieties. Meanwhile, Earl Harold Godwin's son emerged as the most powerful nobleman in England. His military leadership and control over large swaths of land made him a natural successor, though his claim lacked dynastic legitimacy. underscore 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 underscore. The crisis of succession and the Norman claim. In the final years of Edward's reign, the question of succession became urgent. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. According to Norman sources, Harold Godwin's son had even sworn an oath to support William's claim. The veracity of this narrative is uncertain and contested by Anglo-Saxon accounts. Upon Edward's death in January 1066, Harold was crowned king by the Witenagemot. His accession was challenged immediately not only by William of Normandy but also by Harald Hardrada of Norway, who invaded from the north. Harold defeated Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September 1066, demonstrating his military prowess. However, only weeks later, William landed on the southern coast and prepared to press his claim. Part 4: The Norman Conquest and the Transformation of England. The year 1066 is a watershed in English history. It marked not only a dynastic change but a profound transformation in governance, language, culture, and social hierarchy. The Norman conquest replaced an Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a Norman elite and reoriented England's political and cultural ties toward continental Europe. The Battle of Hastings and the fall of the Anglo-Saxons. Following the death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066, the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot elected Harold Godwin's son as king. However, his claim was immediately contested by two powerful foreign rulers, Harald Hardrada of Norway and William, Duke of Normandy. In September 1066, Hardrada invaded northern England with support from Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig. Harold Godwin's son marched north and defeated the Norwegian force at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where both Hardrada and Tostig were killed. Despite the decisive victory, Harold's army was exhausted. Barely 3 weeks later, William of Normandy landed in Sussex with a well-prepared invasion force. On October 14, 1066, the armies met near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings lasted most of the day. Though Harold's shield wall initially withstood Norman assaults, the death of the king, most likely struck in the eye by an arrow, led to a collapse in morale and organization. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had lost its leader, and the road to London was open. Underscore 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 underscore. William I, the Conqueror, and the establishment of Norman rule. William moved cautiously, securing submission from southern English leaders before entering London, where he was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. His coronation at Westminster Abbey symbolized the beginning of a new regime. Despite his triumph, William's rule was not uncontested. Rebellions flared in the north and west of England over the next several years. William responded with brutal efficiency. The most notorious episode was the Harrying of the North, 1069 to 1070, during which large areas of northern England were laid waste, resulting in famine and depopulation. To consolidate his rule, William embarked on a complete restructuring of the English aristocracy. Anglo-Saxon nobles were dispossessed and replaced by Norman barons, who were granted lands in return for military service. This redistribution created a new feudal elite that owed direct allegiance to the king. Feudalism and centralization. The Normans introduced a continental model of feudalism, wherein landholding was closely tied to military obligation and loyalty to the monarch. William insisted on direct oaths of allegiance from all landholding knights, not just to their immediate lords, but to the crown itself, a unique innovation that strengthened royal authority. Administrative centralization was another hallmark of William's reign. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, was an unprecedented survey of landholdings, resources, and population. It served as a basis for taxation, feudal obligations, and dispute resolution, and remains one of the most detailed administrative records from medieval Europe. The Norman kings also maintained strong control over the church. William replaced English bishops with Norman clergy, aligning the ecclesiastical hierarchy with the new regime. Yet he resisted papal interference in royal governance, asserting a degree of independence in ecclesiastical appointments and legal jurisdiction. Underscore 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 underscore. Cultural and linguistic changes. The Norman conquest dramatically altered the linguistic landscape of England. While Old English remained the language of the majority, Norman French became the language of the court, law, and administration. Over time, the coexistence of Anglo-Saxon and Norman linguistic elements contributed to the development of Middle English. Architecture also underwent a revolution. The Normans initiated a wave of Romanesque building, erecting massive stone castles and churches. The Tower of London, built shortly after the conquest, stands as a symbol of Norman military and administrative power. Culturally, the Normans brought continental customs in art, chivalry, and governance. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions gave rise to a hybrid elite culture that would define the high medieval English identity. Underscore 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 underscore. The succession crisis after William I. William the Conqueror died in 1087. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, inherited Normandy, while his second son, William Rufus, William II, received England. This division created enduring tensions between the Anglo-Norman crown and the Duchy of Normandy. William II's reign, 1087 to 1100, was marked by disputes with the church, noble revolts, and autocratic tendencies. His relationship with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury was particularly fraught, reflecting broader struggles between royal and ecclesiastical authority. William II died under suspicious circumstances during a hunting expedition in the New Forest. His younger brother, Henry I, quickly seized the throne. Underscore 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 underscore. Henry I and the restoration of order. Henry I, RE 1100 to 1135, sought to strengthen royal authority and repair relations with the Church. He issued the Charter of Liberties, a predecessor to later constitutional documents, promising to curb abuses of royal power. Henry reinforced administrative control through the development of the Exchequer, a financial department to monitor royal income. He appointed justiciars to oversee law and order, laying the foundation for a more institutionalized system of governance. Dynastically, Henry's reign ended in crisis. His only legitimate son perished in the White Ship disaster, 1120, leaving his daughter, Matilda, as heir. Despite her being designated as such, the nobility hesitated to accept a female ruler, setting the stage for civil war. Part 5, The Anarchy, the Plantagenets, and the Rise of a Continental Empire. The death of Henry I's only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster of 1120 precipitated a succession crisis that plunged England into nearly 2 decades of civil war and instability, a period later termed the Anarchy. Henry had designated his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir, but her gender and foreign connections made her acceptance controversial among the English nobility. The succession crisis and civil war. Upon Henry's death in 1135, his nephew Stephen of Blois swiftly crossed from Normandy to claim the English throne. His accession was supported by many barons who feared female rule and sought stability. However, Matilda contested Stephen's claim, supported notably by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and several key nobles. The ensuing conflict was marked by sieges, shifting allegiances, and widespread disorder. Royal authority fragmented, and many regions experienced de facto independent rule by local magnates. The conflict significantly weakened the monarchy and the country's institutions. The Resolution and the Treaty of Wallingford. By 1153, after nearly 2 decades of warfare, a compromise was reached. The Treaty of Wallingford allowed Stephen to remain king for his lifetime but recognized Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, as his heir. This agreement ended the Civil War and paved the way for a new dynasty. The rise of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne as Henry II in 1154, marking the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 3 centuries. Henry's reign was transformative, characterized by legal reforms, administrative centralization, and territorial expansion. Legal and administrative reforms. Henry II is renowned for laying the foundation of the English common law system. He established royal courts, circuit judges, and standardized legal procedures that reduced the arbitrary power of local lords. The Assize of Clarendon, 1166. And subsequent reforms sought to regularize criminal justice and extend royal authority into local affairs. Administratively, Henry improved tax collection and strengthened the exchequer. His reforms professionalized governance and curtailed baronial autonomy. Territorial expansion, the Angevin Empire. Through inheritance, marriage, and conquest, Henry II amassed vast continental possessions including Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 brought the extensive Duchy of Aquitaine under English control. This collection of lands, often called the Angevin Empire, made the English crown a dominant force in Western Europe. However, governing these diverse and distant territories posed ongoing challenges, especially in balancing interests between England and the continent. Conflicts with the Church and Thomas Becket. Henry II's reign was marked by tensions with the Church, epitomized by his conflict with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. The dispute centered on the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts and the rights of clerics accused of secular crimes. Becket's murder in 1170, allegedly with Henry's tacit approval, caused a scandal and led to the king's temporary penance. The episode highlighted the delicate balance between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. Art 6, the later Plantagenets, Magna Carta, and the evolution of Parliament. The reigns of the later Plantagenet monarchs witnessed significant constitutional developments, including the sealing of the Magna Carta and the gradual emergence of Parliament as a political institution. These changes laid important foundations for English governance and law. King Richard I and King John. Richard I, art 1189 to 1199, known as Richard the Lionheart, was primarily occupied with crusading activities in the Holy Land and defending his continental possessions. His absence led to administrative challenges and heavy taxation. His brother John succeeded him in 1199. John's reign, 1199 to 1216, was troubled by military defeats, loss of territories in France, and disputes with the barons and the church. His arbitrary rule and fiscal pressures culminated in widespread baronial rebellion. The Magna Carta, 1215. In 1215, under mounting pressure from rebellious barons, King John agreed to the Magna Carta, a charter that limited royal authority by establishing legal protections for the nobility and certain rights regarding taxation and justice. Although initially a failed peace treaty, the Magna Carta became a lasting symbol of constitutional limits on monarchy. The evolution of Parliament. The early 13th century saw the gradual institutionalization of councils of barons and clergy, which evolved into the Parliament. These assemblies became forums for discussing taxation and legislation, reflecting the increasing complexity of governance. The reigns of Henry III and Edward I. Henry III, art 1216 to 1272, sought to restore royal authority but faced ongoing conflicts with the barons. His reign included the Provisions of Oxford, 1258, which attempted to establish a form of constitutional government. Edward I, art 1272 to 1307, strengthened royal power and legal systems, including reforms that shaped common law. He summoned model parliaments, which included commoners alongside nobles and clergy, further developing parliamentary governance. Art 7, The 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. The late medieval period in England was marked by two major conflicts that profoundly shaped the political landscape: the 100 Years' War with France and the internal dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. The 100 Years' War was a series of intermittent conflicts between England and France over claims to the French throne and territorial disputes. It began during the reign of Edward III, who asserted his claim as the rightful king of France through his mother. The war featured famous battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English forces, often outnumbered, secured remarkable victories largely due to the use of the longbow and innovative tactics. Despite early successes, the war dragged on for over a century, draining resources and exacerbating internal tensions. The tide turned in favor of the French under leaders like Joan of Arc, culminating in English losses of most continental possessions except Calais. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. Following the 100 Years' War, England entered a period of dynastic conflict between two branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York. The Wars of the Roses were characterized by a series of civil wars, shifting alliances, and political intrigue. The emblematic Red Rose of Lancaster and White Rose of York gave the conflict its name. Key figures included Henry VI, Lancaster, Edward IV, York, Richard III, York, and Henry Tudor, who would ultimately end the wars by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. The conclusion of these wars led to the establishment of the Tudor dynasty and a period of relative stability and centralization. Part 8, The Tudor Era and the Foundations of Modern England. The Tudor dynasty, beginning with Henry VI's accession in 1485, marked a transformative period in English history. The Tudors strengthened royal authority, reformed religion, and laid important foundations for the modern English state. Henry VII and the end of the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field ended the Wars of the Roses and established the Tudor dynasty. His reign focused on consolidating power, stabilizing the economy, and reducing the influence of the nobility through policies such as the use of the Star Chamber. Henry VIII and the English Reformation. Henry VIII, or 1509 to 1547, is perhaps the most famous Tudor monarch. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon led to a break with the Roman Catholic Church and the creation of the Church of England, with the monarch as its supreme head. This religious upheaval, known as the English Reformation, resulted in the dissolution of monasteries, redistribution of church lands, and significant social and political change. Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan era. Elizabeth I, r. 1558 to 1603, presided over a flourishing of English culture, exploration, and relative religious stability. Her reign saw the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and the patronage of writers such as William Shakespeare. The Elizabethan era laid cultural and political foundations that influenced subsequent English history. Part 9, The Stuarts, Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. The Stuart period, 1603 to 1714, was marked by profound political, religious, and constitutional upheavals that reshaped the monarchy and governance of England. The Union of the Crowns. In 1603, the death of Elizabeth I without an heir led to the accession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. This personal union initiated new political dynamics but did not create a single unified state. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. Tensions between King Charles I and Parliament over taxation, religion, and royal prerogative erupted into civil war. The conflict pitted royalists, cavaliers, against parliamentarians, roundheads, culminating in the trial and execution of Charles I in 1649. The Commonwealth and Protectorate. Following the king's execution, England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. The Protectorate sought to enforce Puritan moral reforms and maintain strict control but ultimately failed to establish lasting political stability. The Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. The monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II. His reign balanced royal authority with growing parliamentary power. However, religious tensions and fears of absolutism persisted. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 deposed James II in favor of William III and Mary II, establishing constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights, 1689, codified parliamentary supremacy and individual rights, profoundly influencing the future of English governance. Part 10: The Formation of Great Britain and the Georgian Era. The early 18th century witnessed the political union of England and Scotland and the rise of the Georgian monarchs, which shaped the trajectory of Britain as a global power. The Act of Union 1707. In 1707, the Acts of Union united the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. This political merger dissolved the separate Scottish and English parliaments, creating a single parliament at Westminster. The union was motivated by economic, political, and security concerns, establishing a more centralized government. The Hanoverian succession. Following the death of Queen Anne in 1714, the throne passed to George I, Elector of Hanover, inaugurating the Hanoverian dynasty. The early Georgian period was characterized by relative political stability and the strengthening of constitutional monarchy. Political developments. The role of the Prime Minister emerged during this era, with figures such as Robert Walpole exercising increasing influence. Parliamentary government expanded, and party politics between the Whigs and Tories became entrenched. Economic and colonial expansion. Britain expanded its overseas empire, including territories in North America, the Caribbean, and India. The rise of commerce, industry, and naval power laid the groundwork for British dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries. Part 11: The Industrial Revolution and the Victorian Age. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed profound social, economic, and political transformations as Britain became the world's first industrialized nation. The Industrial Revolution. Beginning in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution introduced mechanized manufacturing, new technologies, and urbanization. Innovations such as the steam engine, textile machinery, and the expansion of coal mining revolutionized production and transportation. This period saw significant demographic changes, with populations shifting from rural areas to rapidly growing industrial cities. Social and political changes. Industrialization brought new social challenges, including poor working conditions, child labor, and urban poverty. These issues spurred early labor movements and reforms. Politically, the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, saw gradual expansion of the electoral franchise, reform acts, and the strengthening of parliamentary democracy. Queen Victoria's long reign symbolized stability and imperial grandeur. The British Empire. During this period, Britain expanded its global empire to its greatest extent, encompassing colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The empire's wealth and resources fueled further industrial and military strength. Part 12: The 20th Century and the Evolution of the United Kingdom. The 20th century was one of the most transformative eras in the history of Britain, encompassing monumental political, social, and economic changes that reshaped not only the British Isles but also its role on the world stage. From the devastation of two world wars to the dissolution of its vast empire and the restructuring of its constitutional framework, this period fundamentally altered the identity and trajectory of the nation. The impact of World War I, 1914 to 1918. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 thrust Britain into a global conflict of unprecedented scale. As part of the Allied powers, Britain mobilized millions of men, drawn from the British Isles and across the empire. The war effort demanded extensive industrial production, leading to significant social changes including the increased participation of women in the workforce. The human cost was staggering, approximately 900,000 British military deaths and over 2 million wounded. The war also precipitated profound shifts in British society. Traditional class structures were challenged by shared sacrifice, and returning veterans demanded greater social justice. Politically, the war led to expanded suffrage with the Representation of the People Act 1918, which enfranchised all men over 21 and women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications, a significant step toward universal suffrage. The interwar period, economic challenges and social change. The post-war years brought economic difficulties. The Great Depression of the 1930s severely affected industrial regions, leading to high unemployment and social unrest. Nevertheless, the period also saw important reforms in social welfare and housing, aimed at improving living conditions for the working class. Internationally, Britain struggled to maintain its global influence amid rising tensions in Europe and growing nationalist movements in its colonies. The League of Nations, which Britain helped to establish, ultimately failed to prevent further conflict. World War II, 1939 to 1945, and its aftermath. The Second World War further tested Britain's resilience. The Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign by Nazi Germany, devastated cities and civilian populations but also galvanized national unity and determination. Britain played a critical role in the Allied victory, contributing military leadership, intelligence operations, including code-breaking at Bletchley Park, and vast human and material resources. However, the war left the British economy severely weakened and accelerated demands for decolonization. The immediate post-war period saw the creation of the welfare state under the Labour government led by Clement Attlee. Landmark initiatives included the founding of the National Health Service (NHS) in 1948, providing free healthcare to all citizens, and the expansion of social security programs. Decolonization and the end of empire. After the war, Britain embarked on a process of decolonization. India's independence in 1947 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, many African, Caribbean, and Asian colonies gained independence, often through negotiated settlement, though sometimes through conflict. This transition transformed Britain's international role from an imperial power to a leading member of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states with shared historical ties. Constitutional developments and the United Kingdom. The 20th century also witnessed significant constitutional evolution. The Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949 curtailed the power of the House of Lords, enhancing the supremacy of the elected House of Commons. Devolution became a prominent issue late in the century. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland each gained varying degrees of legislative autonomy by the end of the 1990s, reflecting the complex national identities within the United Kingdom. Part 13, Contemporary Britain, Brexit, and Future Prospects. The dawn of the 21st century ushered in new challenges and transformations for Britain as it grappled with globalization, changing political landscapes, and debates over its place in Europe and the wider world. Political landscape in the early 21st century. The early decades of the 2000s saw shifts in political power, with Labour under Tony Blair winning a landslide victory in 1997. Blair's government implemented reforms in health, education, and welfare and played a controversial role in international affairs, particularly the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which polarized public opinion. The Conservative Party regained power in 2010, forming a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, marking a period of austerity policies aimed at reducing public deficits following the 2008 global financial crisis. The Scottish independence movement and devolution. Devolution processes initiated in the late 20th century culminated in the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Synod, and Northern Ireland Assembly, granting these nations significant self-governing powers. In 2014, Scotland held a referendum on independence, which was narrowly defeated. The referendum intensified debates about national identity and the future constitutional arrangement of the United Kingdom. Brexit, the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union. A defining event of recent British history was the 2016 referendum in which a majority voted to leave the European Union, a decision with profound political, economic, and social consequences. Brexit negotiations and implementation dominated British politics for several years, affecting trade, immigration, and international relations. The departure formally occurred on January 31, 2020, ending over 4 decades of membership. Economic and social challenges. Post-Brexit Britain faced economic uncertainties compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, which severely affected public health and the economy. The government implemented unprecedented fiscal measures to support businesses and citizens. Socially, debates over immigration, national identity, and regional autonomy continued to shape public discourse, alongside challenges such as climate change and technological transformation. Looking ahead, Britain in the 21st century.
Contemporary Britain stands at a crossroads, balancing tradition and innovation, national unity and regional aspirations, global engagement and domestic priorities.
The evolving constitutional arrangements, demographic changes, and geopolitical shifts will likely continue to shape the country's trajectory in coming decades.